The Basketball Diaries, 1995, was never a film that could hide from the weight of its financial journey, because everything about it carried the air of a risk taken with limited room for error. It was born from a story raw and uncomfortable, pulled from pages that had already lived as memoir, and turned into images that would demand both courage and restraint. Its money path began as a fragile current of belief, the kind of faith that does not flow easily when the subject matter is addiction, despair, and lost youth. The project's existence itself was proof that someone had decided that honesty was worth the cost, that audiences could be asked to sit with ugliness and fragility if the craft carried enough truth to hold them. From the earliest stages, those inside the film must have felt that their task was to turn scarce resources into piercing atmosphere, to make the limitations visible only in patience and grit, not in the images that reached the screen. What appears in the film is lean, stripped of excess, yet it never feels hollow. That spareness was both aesthetic and financial. Locations are tight: hallways, alleys, cramped rooms, basketball courts worn down by constant use. These choices were not only faithful to the source but efficient. They allowed production to concentrate energy where it mattered most. In the faces of young actors carrying enormous weight, in the details of a city that already looked aged and bruised, in the immediacy of scenes that unfold with little need for embellishment. To anyone watching, the settings feel authentic because they are stripped of gloss. For the crew, this must have meant working quickly, turning real spaces into lived stages without the cushion of elaborate dressing. Every dollar and every hour went directly into creating authenticity that looked accidental, as though the camera had simply wandered into the lives of lost kids. The unfolding of the financial path followed this same principle of concentration. Because there was no luxury to waste, every decision was pressed through a filter of necessity. A scene of boys playing basketball on cracked concrete needed little build, but it needed time to capture the rhythm of sweat, shouts, and exhaustion. That time was the investment. A scene of descent into addiction did not rely on costly tricks, but on performance and atmosphere. Light falling harshly through a window, skin filmed with sweat, dialogue delivered with jagged rhythm. These moments asked little in material terms, but much in preparation and trust. The money arc of the film was defined by this balance, stripping away anything not essential so that what remained could feel alive. The financial reality was always felt by those making the film. Cast and crew were aware that this was not a production with endless safety nets. Each delay mattered, each wasted take pressed more heavily. That awareness shaped their behavior. Actors carried their intensity into every scene, knowing that indulgence in repetition was not a luxury afforded here. Crews worked with efficiency born of necessity, moving equipment with urgency, adjusting lights with precision, conscious that time was weight. The emotional texture of navigating money on this set was a mixture of pressure and pride. Pressure because limits were always close, pride because the work was not about excess but about truth. They were not building a spectacle. They were carving out a raw slice of reality with what they had. The city itself gave back what money could not buy. Streets already carried the scars of disrepair. Stairwells already echoed with the sounds of struggle. Basketball courts already looked battered by use. By pointing the camera at these realities, the production saved resources while gaining atmosphere that could not have been faked. This was financial logic turned into artistic logic. Instead of spending to build, they spent to capture. Every corner of the city became part of the financial arc, allowing truth to stand in for construction. That decision created a film that felt immediate, intimate, and unvarnished. For those involved, it must have been both liberating and exhausting, because it meant leaning constantly on the unpredictability of real locations, dealing with noise, crowds, weather, and limits, while trusting that the result would be worth the struggle. Inside the financial arc, the cast bore unique weight. The story depended almost entirely on the performance of its lead, and that meant the production's money path was inextricably tied to the ability of one actor to deliver. Every moment spent on him was an investment, and every success of his performance was a return. The intensity of that burden shaped the set's energy. Crews must have felt the pressure to support him fully, because his success was their success. The financial reality was not abstract, it was embodied in his exhaustion, his ability to sustain performance through grueling scenes of collapse and despair. The rhythm of money shaped the rhythm of shooting. There were days when everything aligned, locations available, light cooperative, performances sharp. On those days, confidence grew, and the production moved with a feeling of flow. But there were also days when conditions strained the balance. delays waiting for weather, interruptions from outside the set, technical issues stretching precious hours. On those days, the financial arc pressed down most heavily, and everyone felt the tightening of options. Choices had to be made quickly, sometimes cutting corners, sometimes reducing scope, always aware that the budget's limits were close. This rhythm of ease and strain mirrored the story being told, where moments of exhilaration on the court gave way to collapse off it, where bursts of freedom dissolved into pressure. The film's own financial journey became part of its texture, woven into its stops and starts, its bursts of intensity and its lulls. For those living inside this arc, the sensation was not just pressure but also resilience. They adjusted constantly, bending to circumstances, finding ways to turn limits into strengths. The decision to stage so much of the film in naturalistic spaces was partly artistic, partly financial, but once made, it gave the film its character. The constraint of not being able to overindulge in elaborate setups created a tone of raw immediacy. For the director, this meant steering vision within boundaries, finding boldness in restraint. For the crew, it meant carrying the weight of efficiency on their shoulders, knowing that the smooth running of each day was the difference between success and struggle. In the weeks of production, money was not a distant abstraction. It was felt in every delay, every triumph, every exhausted evening when another day had been completed within limits. It lived in the meals, the pace, the quality of equipment, the patience of leadership. It shaped mood, energy, and relationships. It created a kind of unity because everyone shared the knowledge that they were making something under constraint. That success would mean not just completing the film, but completing it truthfully, with its voice intact. That unity gave the set its resilience. Looking back at the finished film, the financial path is visible in its spareness. The camera rarely leaves the faces of its characters, rarely expands outward to show more than it must. The restraint is palpable. Scenes feel stripped down to essence, and that essence is what carries the film. The financial arc did not limit the story so much as carve it into sharper relief. Its rawness is not just a creative decision but a financial one, born of necessity, embraced as identity. The film feels as though it was made with urgency, and that urgency is part of its strength. For the participants, the money journey was likely remembered as both burden and badge. Burden because it pressed on every decision, every delay, every moment of fatigue. Badge because it gave the film authenticity, shaping it into something leaner, sharper, more truthful than it might have been with abundance. They lived the tension between scarcity and creativity, and they came out with a film that bears the marks of both. The Basketball Diaries remains a testament to what can be done when financial arcs are carried not with indulgence, but with discipline, when money shapes not spectacle but intimacy. Its journey was one of faith, restraint, and resilience. It was lived in dust, sweat, long waits, quick moves, and the weight of authenticity. Its story on screen mirrors its story off screen. A fight to survive, a struggle within limits, a determination to push forward even when resources were thin. That is its money journey, not abstract, not distant, but lived in every frame, felt in every choice, remembered by all who carried it to completion. The Basketball Diaries carried with it a scale that was never meant to overwhelm in size, but rather to feel immediate, raw, and close to the bone. Its ambition was not to build sprawling sets or vast landscapes, but to hold a mirror to a city that already contained the weight of its own scars. The production aimed for a scope that could stay intimate while still giving audiences the impression of a world closing in around its characters. On set, that scale was felt in the way the camera hugged faces, lingered in hallways, and pressed into cramped apartments. On screen, it is visible in the small spaces that seem to trap the characters, a reflection of both narrative intent and the limits under which the film was built. The scale was not large, but it was dense, every frame filled with effort to make the city's grit feel both authentic and suffocating. Time was concentrated heavily in a handful of key spaces. Basketball courts formed the backdrop of the boys' fleeting innocence. Schools and classrooms framed the illusion of structure, and apartments, stairwells, and alleys painted the descent into chaos. For those on set, it meant revisiting these same spaces repeatedly, shaping them to hold different moods depending on where the story was in its arc. The court that glowed with youthful energy in one sequence could later feel hollow and desperate, shot under different light, and filled with silence instead of laughter. Concentration of effort in these spaces allowed the production to extract as much atmosphere as possible, stretching limited resources by squeezing every possible layer of meaning from a few locations. People were concentrated accordingly. Crews moved equipment efficiently between familiar corners of the city. Actors became accustomed to embodying their characters in rooms they knew intimately, and everyone involved leaned into repetition as both a cost-saving measure and a creative choice that mirrored the cyclical traps of addiction. Tools, too, reflected this concentration. Cameras were used not to sweep across wide vistas, but to burrow into personal space. Every lens choice, every movement was designed to make the viewer feel present in the heat of a moment rather than distant from it. Lights were arranged to exaggerate the harshness of certain environments, casting long shadows across tired faces, or to amplify the dreamlike disorientation of a high. Sound captured echoes from real hallways, the squeak of sneakers on cracked concrete, the ambient hum of a city that never softened. On set, crew members lived within these constraints, making practical adjustments to extract maximum effect from what was available. The tools had to serve the intimacy of the film's vision, not the grandeur of spectacle. Early creative choices set limits that shaped the rest of the production. The decision to stay rooted in the realism of lived spaces meant that there was little room for indulgence in polished artifice. That choice gave the film its authenticity, but it also locked the team into a path where every scene had to find meaning within raw, often unforgiving environments. There was no option to mask or decorate. The city itself was the canvas, and its imperfections had to be embraced. Another early choice, to focus almost entirely on the internal journey of one character, meant that the production's scale had to follow him relentlessly. The camera was chained to his descent, and so the budget was chained to his path. This singular focus limited the opportunity for diversions or expansions into subplots, but it also gave the film cohesion. On set, the weight of this choice meant that days revolved around one actor's presence, with everyone else orbiting around his performance. The commitment demanded intensity but also magnified vulnerability, because if he faltered, the entire structure faltered with him. The size of the project shaped daily decisions in countless ways. There was no room for extravagance, so every plan had to be examined for efficiency. Shooting schedules were tight, often leaving little time to repeat shots endlessly. Directors, assistants, and crew weighed constantly whether a moment had been captured strongly enough to move on or whether they could risk another take. Sets were often real locations, and the unpredictability of those spaces shaped how each day unfolded. Noise from outside, interruptions from passers-by, or sudden shifts in weather could force adjustments that tested patience. With limited means, there was little choice but to adapt quickly. That necessity influenced morale. Some days it created a sense of camaraderie, as though the whole team were fighting the city together. Other days it created frustration, as though the city itself resisted the telling of its story. Morale was also tied to the weight of the subject matter. Scenes depicting laughter on the basketball court carried energy and lightness, and the set reflected that mood, even if briefly. But scenes of withdrawal, desperation, and crime pressed heavily on everyone involved. When resources were thin and hours were long, filming such material amplified the sense of strain. Crew members and actors alike felt the pressure of having to capture darkness convincingly while also navigating the constraints of time and budget. For some, this created exhaustion. For others, it deepened pride in the work, because every successful shot felt like proof that they were overcoming both creative and financial hurdles. The pressure of turning plan into pages, scenes, and moments was always present. Scripts on paper read as fluid journeys, but translating them into lived reality meant carving each page into fragments of labor. A single scene of boys sharing drugs in a cramped bathroom might have looked simple in writing, but on set it required coordination of light, sound, performance, and timing under conditions that were often far from ideal. Each day was a negotiation between what the script promised and what the budget allowed. Sometimes the result matched perfectly, the rawness of the set aligning with the rawness of the scene. Other times compromises had to be made, trimming dialogue, adjusting shots, or leaning on performance more heavily than design. This process was lived by everyone as a constant balance between vision and feasibility. From the perspective of those making it, the scale of the film was always palpable. It was not grand in the way of massive productions, but its intimacy brought its own magnitude. Being confined to smaller spaces with minimal cushion meant that every mistake was magnified, every victory felt larger. Crew members could see immediately when something worked, and they knew immediately when something had slipped, because there was no gloss to disguise it. This awareness shaped the energy of the set, keeping everyone alert, engaged, and often anxious. The film's small scale did not mean it carried less weight. It meant the weight was pressed more directly onto those involved. As the days of production accumulated, the scale revealed itself in the texture of the work. Crew members became experts in efficiency. Actors bore the responsibility of sustaining the film's intensity without faltering, and the director guided vision with the restraint of someone who knew the boundaries could not be ignored. The film's ambition was never to be wide, but to be deep, and that ambition was both empowered and limited by its financial arc. The city became its greatest tool, its greatest obstacle, and its most authentic partner. The constraints became the film's character, and in the end, that character is what reached the screen. Looking at the finished product, the spareness and intimacy are inseparable from the way it was made. The production scale was modest, but it carved intensity by focusing everything it had into a narrow channel. The budget was lived in the sweat of cramped locations, the fatigue of long days, the rawness of performances captured quickly and without indulgence. Every frame bears the mark of constraint turned into style. The Basketball Diaries exists as both a story of addiction and a story of how ambition can live within limits, how scale can be small yet profound, how money can be scarce yet sufficient when directed with clarity. Those who lived inside it carried the memory of a production where every day was measured, where resources were finite, but where the story itself gave back more than the money spent. Its scale was not measured in excess, but in authenticity, and that authenticity was the truest return on the effort poured into it. The budget lived not as abstraction but as atmosphere, guiding choices, pressing on patience, shaping tone, and binding the film into the lean, unforgettable shape it took on screen. The Basketball Diaries moved through its life on a rhythm that was as fragile as the story it carried. Its path to support was never the tale of instant confidence, because the subject itself was too raw, too unpolished, and too close to the bone for easy faith. What it found first was the kind of belief that arrives quietly, born out of conviction rather than security. That early trust was thin but vital, and for those who carried the project it felt like a fragile thread strong enough to hold them long enough to take their first steps. It was not yet momentum, but it was permission, the sense that someone had leaned forward just enough to say, "Begin." From inside, that mattered more than any other marker, because without that first step, there was no way to carry the story of loss and descent onto a screen at all. As support began to take form, it did not all flow at once. Those willing to step in early were moved by the raw material itself, by the honesty of the story, and the chance to shape something intimate. Later commitments carried a different texture. They were grounded in the visible progress of the film. The cast assembled, the script sharpened, the spaces secured. Early support felt like faith without evidence. Late support felt like confidence built on proof. Within the team, this staggered alignment was keenly felt. There were days when enthusiasm and backing surged together, when the flow of confidence created momentum. But there were also days of waiting, when the next step depended on assurance that had not yet arrived, and those pauses pressed heavily on morale. Tight timing colored the experience of the production at several key points. There were stretches when schedules felt squeezed, when access to a location was limited to a handful of hours, or when sequences had to be captured in far less time than they deserved. On those days, the crew moved with urgency, aware that hesitation could cost them more than they could afford. The pressure translated into a bracing kind of focus. Equipment was adjusted with speed, instructions were short and sharp, and actors carried the tension into their performances, sometimes delivering takes with a rawness that no rehearsal could have created. These moments left their mark on the film's texture, scenes that carried a sense of immediacy, not only from narrative intent, but also from the lived pressure of having to capture something within limits. At other times, the timing relaxed, and the difference was felt in every corner of the set. When schedules opened and resources aligned, there was room for patience. Actors were able to let scenes breathe, exploring silences or subtle gestures that might have been lost under pressure. The crew found time to refine the play of light across a wall, to adjust framing for nuance rather than necessity. These days created sequences that feel more measured on screen, scenes that unfold with slower rhythm, more space, more quietness. The ebb and flow between tight and relaxed timing became part of the film's pacing itself, shaping its shifts between intensity and contemplation. The rhythm of support influenced not only how the work was done, but how it felt to those doing it. When energy and confidence flowed, the set carried a buoyancy that lightened even the heaviest scenes. People smiled more easily, found humor in long hours, and carried pride in what they were making. But when support faltered or arrived late, the weight of doubt pressed down. Fatigue deepened, tempers shortened, and the act of pushing forward became heavier. Fatigue deepened, tempers shortened, and the act of pushing forward became heavier. The crew lived this rhythm viscerally, their own moods reflecting the timing of resources. The director and leads bore the brunt of it, carrying the responsibility of shielding morale, steadying vision, and reminding everyone of the purpose that held them there. Waiting became its own form of labor. There were times when the project could not move until another piece of support arrived, and in those pauses, the cast and crew lived in uncertainty. Days of inactivity stretched like shadows, filled with conversations about what was to come, with rehearsals that could only go so far without progress, with the gnawing awareness that time was slipping away while nothing moved. Yet waiting also forged resilience. When the pause broke, when support finally shifted forward, the movement felt electric. The relief of action replaced the heaviness of delay, and the set erupted with determination to make up for lost time. That cycle of waiting and moving etched itself into the experience, training everyone to live with uncertainty while preparing for bursts of momentum. Adjusting was not an occasional act but a constant one. Plans on paper rarely held intact through the realities of production. Locations shifted, schedules bent, performances were adapted to new constraints. The crew became adept at bending without breaking, learning to improvise solutions in the moment. A scene meant for daylight might be captured at dusk. A sequence planned for one location might be reimagined in another. For actors, adjustment meant carrying intensity into conditions that sometimes undercut comfort, performing in spaces too small, too noisy, too unpredictable. Yet these adjustments often created moments of surprising authenticity. The rawness of unplanned imperfections gave the film its immediacy, its sense of being caught rather than staged. The act of pushing forward became the defining feature of the film's financial journey. Whatever the timing, whatever the rhythm, the project never stopped moving. There were stumbles, pauses, accelerations, but the forward motion never ceased. That persistence defined the experience for those inside it. Every obstacle became part of the texture. Every delay folded into the story of how the film was made. By the time it reached completion, the cast and crew had lived not only the narrative of descent and survival on screen, but also the narrative of navigating support in real time. On screen, this journey is visible in the tension between immediacy and patience, in the way some scenes feel sharp and jagged while others linger in silence. That contrast is not only narrative but reflective of the conditions under which the film was made. The rhythm of its financial path is written into its very style, into its pacing, its tone, its atmosphere. For audiences, it appears as a natural rhythm. For those who lived it, it was the daily reality of support that came in waves rather than steady streams. Looking back, the film's financing and timing reveal themselves not as abstract mechanics, but as lived experiences that shaped every detail. Support lined up slowly, unevenly, moving from fragile early faith to steadier late confidence. Commitments arrived with different textures, some born of belief, some born of proof, and those differences were felt keenly by those inside. Timing stretched tight or loose, shaping not only schedules but performances and moods. The rhythm of support became the rhythm of the film itself, its pacing, its tone, its energy. And through it all, the sense of waiting, moving, adjusting, and pushing forward was constant, the quiet heartbeat beneath the story of boys lost and searching for themselves. The Basketball Diaries endures not only as a film of raw honesty, but as a record of the fragile, uneven, and deeply human path of its financial journey. It carries in its grain the marks of faith, delay, adjustment, and resolve. To watch it is to see not only the descent of its characters, but also the resilience of those who made it, living through the uncertain flow of support until their story found its shape on screen. The Basketball Diaries unfolded with ambition that was never loud or sprawling but intense, pressing all its weight into intimacy rather than grandeur. Its most ambitious attempt was not in creating vast worlds or elaborate spectacles, but in carrying a story of descent with such relentless focus that the audience could not escape the suffocating atmosphere of addiction. This was a boldness of scope, because it meant resting everything on the performance of one young lead, trusting that his face, his voice, his gestures could sustain the gravity of the entire film. It was ambition not in scale but in concentration. On set, that ambition was felt every day, because every choice circled back to how convincingly the core unraveling could be portrayed, how deeply the camera could dig into despair without breaking authenticity. The film tried to show a city that was both real and mythic in its harshness. Its streets and alleys were not just background but embodiments of decline, corridors that echoed with the noise of lives already frayed. The ambition here was to make the city itself speak, to let cracked pavement and dim stairwells feel as expressive as dialogue. That required vision and effort because it meant finding the right spaces, waiting for the right light, capturing sound that carried the grime of the environment. On screen, the result is a city that breathes hostility and indifference, a landscape where youth falters without guidance. For those working within it, this ambition demanded patience and endurance because the real spaces they used were often unpredictable, and transforming those spaces into cinematic voices required more than simple presence. It required constant adjustment, improvisation, and care. At the same time, restraint shaped the film just as much as ambition. From the earliest creative choices, it was clear that the story would not sprawl outward into elaborate subplots or broaden its world into endless digressions. It would hold tightly to its central character and his circle, letting everything else fall away. This restraint was practical. It conserved resources by narrowing focus, but it also gave the film its intensity. By not scattering attention, the story tightened, forcing every scene to serve the central descent. For the team, this restraint gave clarity. They knew where the heart of the film lay, and they did not have to waste energy building unnecessary diversions. For the audience, the restraint is felt as intimacy, the sense of being pressed uncomfortably close to collapse without relief. Another act of restraint came in the choice to show the pain of addiction without leaning heavily into graphic excess. The film depicts desperation, hallucinations, crime, and collapse, but it rarely indulges in spectacle for its own sake. This decision was both practical and artistic. Excessive staging of violence or degradation would have stretched resources and risked alienating viewers. By holding back, the film allowed suggestion and performance to carry what could not be elaborately staged. The restraint also protected tone, keeping the film grounded in raw honesty rather than sliding into melodrama. On set, this restraint meant capturing performances with fewer effects, focusing energy on subtle expressions rather than elaborate setups. It was a choice that kept the film producible while preserving its gravity. Trade-offs define the path forward. To create authenticity, the film leaned heavily on real locations, which gave atmosphere without heavy construction but also brought unpredictability. This saved resources while demanding flexibility. Another trade-off was between length and depth. Many aspects of the original memoir could not be fully explored within the limits of production, so choices were made to concentrate on key arcs rather than sprawling coverage. This kept the story coherent but sacrificed certain details, a compromise necessary to bring the film into being. For the cast, trade-offs were personal. Scenes often had to be done quickly, which meant carrying intensity into fewer takes. The actors bore the pressure of delivering truth under time constraints, trading comfort for authenticity. The crew made similar sacrifices, moving equipment swiftly, forgoing elaborate refinements to keep schedules intact. These trade-offs are visible in the final film, which feels lean and urgent rather than polished and expansive. Scope decisions directly shaped tone and pacing. The decision to focus relentlessly on the protagonist meant that the film carried his rhythm. Rapid highs on the basketball court, jagged crashes into addiction, languid stretches of despair. Pacing was uneven by design, mirroring the instability of his life. Scenes on the court are brisk, full of energy, cut with vitality. Scenes of addiction slow into drawn-out silences or fragmented sequences, giving audiences the disorientation of collapse. This rhythm was not accidental. It was the direct result of scope. By narrowing the story, the film could afford to mirror instability without losing coherence. The tone was similarly influenced. Instead of balancing despair with sweeping vistas or unrelated subplots, the film stayed close to its central darkness. The result was a tone that never softened, a steady weight pressing down from start to finish. On set, this was felt as an emotional burden. Actors and crew lived inside that heaviness, repeating scenes of collapse day after day, with little relief. But they also understood that this intensity was the film's strength. The final results on screen bear the mark of these scope choices. The film feels claustrophobic, not because it lacked ambition, but because its ambition was to trap the viewer inside the same walls and corners where the characters were trapped. The authenticity of locations, the rawness of performance, the refusal to dilute despair with diversion. All of these stem from scope decisions made early and carried through with discipline. The trade-offs, the restraints, the concentration of energy, all shaped the final tone. What might have been weakness in another context became the film's defining strength. Its spareness, its lack of gloss, its focus on performance over spectacle gave it the immediacy and truth that audiences remember. From inside, balancing vision with practicality was a daily negotiation. The director had to weigh every desire for stylization against the realities of what could be achieved within limits. The crew had to turn constraints into tools, finding ways to make scarcity look like authenticity. Actors had to trust that their performances, stripped of excess, would carry enough weight to sustain the film. This balancing act was lived moment by moment, not as abstract discussion, but as decisions about whether to take another shot, whether to adjust light, whether to cut dialogue, whether to push a scene longer or accept it as it was. The tension between vision and practicality was constant, but it was also productive. It sharpened focus, clarified priorities, and forced everyone to dig deeper into the heart of the story. There were moments when vision stretched the limits of practicality, when ambition pressed heavily against constraint. Scenes that required hallucinatory imagery or moments of heightened surrealism tested resources and patience. Yet even here, the film leaned into suggestion rather than excess, letting performance and atmosphere hint at what could not be fully built. This compromise became part of the film's texture, giving it a dreamlike rawness that feels closer to memory than to spectacle. On set, these were the days of highest tension when fatigue ran deepest, but they were also the days when the team felt most alive, attempting something beyond what seemed possible. In the end, the balance held. The vision was not sacrificed, nor was practicality ignored. The film exists as a product of both, ambition carried by restraint, truth carved from constraint. The Basketball Diaries shows what it means for a production to embrace its limits and turn them into voice. The choices that shaped its scope gave it coherence, intensity, and rawness. The trade-offs preserved its integrity. The restraint kept it producible. And the balance of vision with practicality gave it the tone that still lingers long after viewing. For those who lived through its making, the experience must have felt both exhausting and affirming. Exhausting, because every day pressed them against boundaries that could not be ignored. Affirming, because they saw the story take shape not despite those boundaries but through them. They discovered that ambition does not always require breadth, that sometimes depth is more demanding, more powerful, and more true. The scope and constraints of the film shaped not only its final form, but also the experience of everyone involved, leaving them with the memory of having made something raw, immediate, and unforgettable within the confines of practicality. The Basketball Diaries began reaching audiences not with spectacle or loud announcements, but with quiet fragments of imagery and mood that carried the weight of its subject. Its first impressions were always tied to the atmosphere of the story it told. Streets glistening with rain, a young man holding a basketball with promise in his hands, only for that same promise to dissolve into shadows of addiction and loss. Those early signals gave potential viewers a sense that this was not a gentle coming-of-age film, nor a polished sports drama. It was something raw, stripped of comfort, demanding in tone. Awareness grew slowly, shaped less by campaign flourishes and more by the tension in the material itself. For those watching from outside, the first encounters with the film felt like glimpses into a world at once familiar and unsettling. For those inside the project, it was an anxious process, watching to see whether audiences would lean toward curiosity or retreat from discomfort. The early awareness rested on images of youth at the edge of promise. A boy in uniform racing down a basketball court, sweat catching in the light, offered the appearance of energy and hope. The early awareness rested on images of youth at the edge of promise. A boy in uniform racing down a basketball court, sweat catching in the light, offered the appearance of energy and hope. But those same images were set against darker ones: narrow alleys, dimly lit apartments, the sight of a face hollowed by collapse. This contrast was the foundation of how the film introduced itself to the world. Potential audiences were shown that the story would not settle in comfort, that it would move from vigor into despair. The contrast alone was enough to stir attention. It marked the film as distinct, as something that would not hide from the harshest edges of adolescence. Inside the team, that recognition carried relief and apprehension. Relief that the film's essence was being understood, apprehension that such understanding might also keep some audiences away. As chatter began to form around the project, the sense of audience fit sharpened. Those intrigued by stories of raw honesty leaned closer, talking about how rare it was to see addiction and collapse depicted with such directness through the eyes of youth. Others, less comfortable with its tone, questioned whether it was too harsh, too unforgiving, too difficult to endure. The press mirrored this divide. Some voices emphasized the bravery of tackling such material, praising the performances glimpsed in stills or brief descriptions. Others worried aloud about whether audiences would accept so much darkness from a cast of such youth. This accumulation of signals built a complex picture. The film was clearly not going to be embraced universally, but it was also clearly not going to be ignored. Its very subject created a line that separated those who leaned in from those who pulled away. For the team, each signal was felt deeply. When a critic praised the courage of adapting such a memoir, confidence swelled. When a comment suggested that the story might be too bleak for mainstream embrace, unease returned. This cycle repeated constantly in the weeks leading toward release. Confidence was never fixed. It moved like a tide, swelling with recognition, receding with doubt. On set, confidence had been carried by the intensity of performances and the raw power of captured scenes. Off-set, confidence now depended on the slow accumulation of outside voices, on the fragile recognition that the film was being understood for what it was. The lived experience of the team in these moments was a mixture of pride and caution, pride in what they had created, caution in how it might be received. The anticipation before release carried an intensity shaped by these signals. Everyone involved knew that the subject matter would polarize. They also knew that their film's strength lay precisely in that discomfort, in the refusal to soften or dilute. Waiting for release was like standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing that the fall could either be a moment of flight or a hard descent. The uncertainty was heavy. Conversations within the team circled the same points. Would audiences embrace the raw honesty, or would they turn away from the pain? Each passing day before release deepened the tension, as though the film itself was holding its breath. In those final days, the film's identity presented itself to audiences with clarity. Posters and stills showed a young man whose eyes carried both defiance and weariness, signaling a story of promise undone. The basketball, once a symbol of freedom and potential, became an emblem of what was slipping away. The city in the background loomed not as a place of opportunity, but as a trap. Every element of presentation pointed in the same direction. This was a story of youth undone by forces larger than itself, told without comfort, without filter. For potential viewers, the choice was clear. They knew exactly what kind of film this was, and whether they wanted to step into it. The film's awareness path revealed itself not as a process of broad appeal, but as a narrowing of focus. The more people learned, the more they understood the tone, and the more they self-selected into audiences of curiosity or avoidance. The team watched this unfold with mixed feelings. On one hand, it was satisfying to see the film's identity communicated clearly, without misunderstanding. On the other hand, it was sobering to realize how much of the potential audience would likely step away. That duality, pride in clarity, worry in limitation, defined the atmosphere within the team. In the weeks of building awareness, small moments of recognition took on amplified meaning. A writer highlighting the authenticity of its performances felt like confirmation. A commentator remarking on its unflinching tone felt like both validation and warning. Each signal was discussed, dissected, and remembered. Inside the project, the lived experience was one of constant oscillation between optimism and fear, between pride and anxiety. No single signal was definitive, but together they created the mosaic of expectation that hung over the film as it approached its release. What gave the team strength through this process was the knowledge that the film had already accomplished what it set out to do. It had captured rawness with honesty, and that honesty was being seen. Even those who recoiled from the material acknowledged its intensity. That acknowledgement gave the team a fragile but real foundation of confidence. They could not control whether audiences embraced or rejected the discomfort, but they could trust that the film was being understood. That trust steadied them in the tension of waiting. The anticipation, the chatter, the cautious confidence, and the fear all converged into the film's final step toward audiences. For those who made it, awareness was never simply a matter of being noticed. It was a matter of being recognized for what the film truly was. The awareness campaign did not try to disguise or soften. It declared the film's identity clearly and let the audience decide. That clarity was both the source of strength and the reason for uncertainty. The Basketball Diaries did not hide itself, and in not hiding, it risked being left exposed. This process of awareness was not just external, it was lived internally. Cast members thought about how their work would be received, about whether their intensity would be seen as honesty or indulgence. Crew members remembered the sweat of setting lights in cramped hallways, wondering if audiences would notice the authenticity in those shadows. The director carried the weight of knowing that every choice made under constraint would now be judged in the open. The lived awareness was as much about personal investment as it was about public reception. Looking back, the film's awareness path can be seen as a reflection of its story. Just as the protagonist moved from promise into despair, the film itself moved from the promise of curiosity into the uncertainty of release. It confronted audiences with the same choice the characters faced: to look directly at what was uncomfortable or to turn away. In that sense, awareness and identity fused into one. The film could not be separated from its tone, and its marketing could not be separated from its honesty. What audiences saw was what they got, and what the team lived was the tension of watching that honesty meet the world. In the end, the film's identity presented itself as clear and uncompromising. It was a story of youth undone, told with starkness, offered without apology. Audiences first became aware through glimpses of that contrast: basketball courts and alleys, promise and collapse. Chatter and press sharpened the sense of fit, defining the line between those who leaned in and those who pulled away. Confidence inside the team rose and fell with signals, each one a small measure of the path ahead. The anticipation before release carried tension that weighed on everyone, a mix of pride and dread. And when the film's identity finally stood before audiences, it did so with clarity, allowing people to choose it or reject it with open eyes. That was the lived journey of marketing and awareness for the Basketball Diaries. It was never about noise or spectacle, but about mood and tone, about presenting the film's truth and waiting to see how the world would respond. The signals accumulated slowly, the confidence shifted constantly, the anticipation pressed heavily, and the identity held firm. In that balance of clarity and uncertainty, the film made its way into the world, carrying with it both the pride of those who made it and the risk of honesty too sharp to be ignored. The Basketball Diaries arrived at its opening weekend with the weight of months of uncertainty pressing down on those who had carried it. Everyone involved understood from the start that this was not a film built to glide easily into the world. Its subject was too jagged, its tone too raw, its honesty too sharp to guarantee comfort. And yet, that was also its power. The weekend carried the sensation of standing at the edge of a threshold, uncertain whether the film would be embraced as necessary or pushed aside as too painful. There were no illusions of a sweeping, effortless triumph. Instead, the weekend was approached as a temperature check, a first reading of how audiences would receive a work that asked them to look directly at the collapse of youth into addiction. The signals began to arrive slowly, scattered fragments of chatter that trickled in from early screenings. The atmosphere among the team was taut, like a string pulled tight. They had lived for weeks with speculation and doubt, and now those doubts would either ease or deepen depending on how the first wave of viewers responded. Inside the team, pride and fear existed side by side. Pride in what had been achieved under such constraint, fear that the rawness of the film might prove too much for audiences to sit with. In the hours after the first responses began to surface, that duality only sharpened. Some voices admired the intensity of the performances, speaking of how the lead's collapse was almost unbearable in its honesty. Others recoiled at the film's relentlessness, suggesting it was too bleak, too heavy, too unwilling to soften. These divided signals mirrored exactly what the team had anticipated, but living through them in real time carried a different weight than speculating about them beforehand. The opening weekend was less about numbers than about mood. What mattered was the sense of how the film sat with those who saw it. Did they talk about it afterward? Did it linger? Did they tell others it was worth enduring despite its darkness? These were the questions the team turned over as fragments of audience chatter filtered back. For those who responded with admiration, there was a kind of hushed reverence in their words, a recognition that the film had not flinched from its subject. That recognition steadied the team, offering proof that the film's integrity had not been lost in translation from page to screen. Yet alongside those voices came hesitation. Some viewers seemed unsettled, unsure if what they had seen was valuable or simply too uncomfortable. For the team, this was expected but still difficult to hear. They knew that discomfort was the film's nature, but they also knew that discomfort carried risk. The internal atmosphere during those days was one of constant oscillation. One moment, elation at hearing that the lead's performance was being praised as raw and unguarded. The next, a sinking weight as someone reported that the film might be too grim for wider audiences. Conversations swirled with speculation. Could the admiration of some carry the film forward even if others turned away? Could the rawness itself become the reason people sought it out? Or would it limit the film's reach, locking it into a smaller circle of recognition? The answers were unclear, and that uncertainty defined the weekend. It was like holding one's breath, waiting for a verdict that never arrived in clean form, but instead in fragments that could be read either way. Audience behavior began shaping the film's path almost immediately. Those who connected with it spoke with intensity, often urging others to see it despite its heaviness. Their words carried weight because they suggested that the film was not merely watchable but necessary. That kind of endorsement hinted at the possibility of momentum beyond the first weekend. On the other side, those who recoiled tended to step back quietly, warning that the film was too hard to endure. Their reaction suggested that while the film might not expand broadly, it would remain distinct. For the team, these patterns were both reassuring and sobering. Reassuring because the film had made an impact strong enough to provoke passion. Sobering because that passion was not universal. Signs of momentum in the weeks ahead appeared in the way the film began to be talked about as a performance piece. Even when audiences disagreed about tone, they agreed that the central role carried extraordinary weight. That agreement gave the film an anchor. It meant that even those who found the story overwhelming could not deny the intensity of what had been delivered on screen. For the team, this signal was a source of quiet confidence. Whatever else might be said about the film, its performances would not be dismissed. That recognition created the possibility of endurance, of the film finding a place in conversation even if it never became universally embraced. The balance of optimism, caution, and resolve defined the weeks that followed. Optimism grew from the recognition that the film was being talked about at all, that it had not slipped past unnoticed. Caution persisted in the awareness that the conversation was divided, that its rawness would keep some audiences away. Resolve came from the understanding that the film had been made truthfully, that it had achieved what it set out to do, and that whatever happened beyond the opening weekend was beyond control. For those who had lived through the long days of cramped locations, the relentless weight of dark material, and the constant adjustments required by constraint, the very act of seeing the film alive in theaters was a kind of victory. The opening weekend and its trajectory did not provide simple answers. It did not declare the film a triumph or a failure. Instead, it offered signals, fragments of response that sketched the outline of what the path ahead might be. For the team, those signals were enough. They revealed that the film's integrity had been recognized, that its honesty had not gone unnoticed, and that its performances had left a mark. The uncertainty remained, but it was a familiar uncertainty, one that mirrored the very tension of making the film itself. As the weeks unfolded, the chatter continued to ripple. Some voices kept praising the film's unflinching gaze, urging others to confront it. Others repeated their hesitation, cautioning that it was too harsh. This polarization became part of the film's identity, shaping its trajectory as much as the film itself had shaped its awareness. The team learned to live with that divide, accepting that their work had created something that could not be neutral. It demanded response, and in that demand lay its strength. Looking back, the release weekend stands as a reflection of the entire journey. Just as the production itself had been shaped by cycles of waiting, moving, adjusting, and pressing forward, so too was the release shaped by waves of optimism, caution, and resolve. It was not a straight path, not a clear verdict, but a process of living inside uncertainty and continuing forward despite it. The Basketball Diaries carried its story of collapse and resilience into the world with the same fragile determination that had marked its making. Its trajectory was not meteoric, but it was real, shaped by the lived experience of signals felt deeply by those who had risked everything to bring it into being. The Basketball Diaries did not move into the world with a single leap, but through layers, each one ordinary in its own way, each one part of a process that those inside the film understood would be neither glamorous nor immediate. Distribution was not experienced as a sudden surge, but as a sequence of doors opening, some smoothly, others with hesitation. From the outside, it could appear that the film simply arrived, visible one day to audiences who had not seen it the day before. From the inside, the team felt each step separately. The agreements, the scheduling, the gradual widening of the circle that carried their work from the intimacy of set to the uncertainty of the public. These layers were not dramatic, but they were decisive. They formed the quiet infrastructure that allowed the film to move outward while still tethered to its inner core. For the team, The first layer was letting go of the work they had lived with for months. Once the final cut was locked, the film ceased to be theirs alone. It entered a corridor of processes beyond their direct control. Copies were prepared, schedules mapped, slots arranged. The filmmakers watched as their story, once fragile and contained within the walls of cramped apartments and dark alleys, became an object to be handled by others. That transition carried both relief and unease. Relief that the burden of completion had passed, unease that the fate of their work now rested in hands that measured value differently. For the director and actors, the film had been about honesty and intensity. For those moving it through distribution, it became about placement and reach. The shift was ordinary, expected, but it still carried the sting of distance. Practical frictions emerged at every stage, though none of them surprised the team. They were the accepted costs of moving a film from creation to circulation. Materials had to be delivered in precise formats, sometimes redone when specifications shifted. Dates had to be aligned, sometimes altered when conflicts appeared. Negotiations that seemed settled occasionally reopened, dragging processes longer than expected. Each friction was familiar to those who had worked on films before, but for those newer to the journey, it could feel like an endless string of obstacles. Yet within the team, there was little panic. The frictions were lived as part of the terrain, not as disasters. They slowed the pace, yes, but they were endured with the weary patience of people who knew that this was the ordinary shape of the path. For the crew, these steps felt slow compared to the intensity of production. On set, every day had been charged with urgency, each hour heavy with pressure to capture what mattered before resources or time slipped away. In distribution, the urgency dissipated. Weeks stretched with little visible progress, then a sudden flurry of activity, followed again by silence. For those who had sweated under lights in crowded rooms, the slowness was disorienting. Yet they adapted, learning that this phase required a different kind of endurance. Where production demanded speed and improvisation, distribution demanded patience and acceptance. The rhythm shifted from sprint to crawl, and morale adjusted accordingly. Public perception of this process was entirely different. To audiences and even to parts of the press, the film's arrival seemed abrupt. One week it was unseen, the next it appeared as something new to watch and discuss. Few outside the team thought about the layers of movement that preceded that moment. The public saw outcomes, availability, screenings, mentions in articles. They did not see the back and forths over dates, the adjustments to presentation, the logistical delays. Inside the project, this difference was keenly felt. The team carried months of waiting and quiet friction, while audiences perceived only sudden emergence. That dissonance was accepted, even expected. It was part of the invisible labor of filmmaking, the hidden work that allowed the visible to appear seamless. The interior understanding of this path was shaped by calm acknowledgement, rather than dramatic reaction. Everyone involved knew that outcomes would not be clear for some time. A film like this, built on rawness rather than spectacle, would not reveal its trajectory overnight. It would move outward slowly, accumulating presence through gradual ripples rather than sudden waves. The team accepted this reality with a steady patience, focusing less on immediate verdicts and more on the knowledge that their work had already achieved honesty. Distribution was necessary to reach audiences, but it could not alter the essence of what they had made. That knowledge steadied them against impatience. This calm acknowledgement did not erase the strain, but it gave it context. When a delay occurred, the frustration was felt but quickly absorbed into the rhythm of expectation. When a placement shifted, there was irritation but also understanding. The process was never smooth, but it was never catastrophic. It was lived as a sequence of small adjustments, each one absorbed into the larger flow. The team had already endured greater pressures during production. Compared to those long nights and fraught days, the friction of distribution felt manageable. It was not ease, but it was bearable. The outward movement of the film also carried inward ripples. As distribution widened, the film began to belong less to those who made it and more to those who watched it. This transition was felt internally as a loss and a gain. Loss because the intimacy of creation was over, and the film would now be judged in ways its makers could not control. Gain because the story they had fought to capture would now live in others' imaginations, sparking conversations, carrying its rawness beyond the confines of set and crew. For the team, watching this transfer unfold was both unsettling and rewarding. They had carried the film privately, now they watched it become public. Each ordinary step outward was mirrored by an inward reflection. When materials were prepared for wider circulation, the team remembered the first days of shooting, when the film had existed only as fragile ambition. When schedules were set for its unveiling, they thought of the long nights when exhaustion had threatened to overwhelm progress. Each layer of distribution reminded them of the journey already taken. This layering of memory with process gave depth to what otherwise might have felt routine. It turned the ordinary into something more meaningful, because every practical step outward echoed with the lived experiences inward. The difference between perception and understanding became even sharper as early reactions began to arrive from audiences in different places. Public commentary often treated the film's appearance as inevitable, as though it had simply flowed naturally from creation to release. Inside the team, there was an acute awareness of how fragile the journey had been, how many points of delay or derailment could have changed its course. This awareness gave their perspective a sobriety that public chatter lacked. They knew the film's presence in theaters or conversations was not a given, but the result of countless small acts of persistence. That understanding made them less dazzled by attention and more grounded in the reality of what it had taken to reach that point. The calm acknowledgement that outcomes were still unsettled was perhaps the most defining mood of this phase. The team did not look to the early steps of distribution as final proof of success or failure. They understood that what mattered most was endurance, the slow build of recognition, the way conversations might linger. They knew that the film's subject was not designed to create instant comfort, but to provoke reflection, and reflection could take time. This patience was hard-won, cultivated during the long months of production when they had learned to live with uncertainty. It carried them now as they watched their film step into the world. Looking back, distribution and deductions for the Basketball Diaries can be seen as a continuation of the themes that marked its making. Patience under pressure, adjustment under constraint, resilience under uncertainty. The ordinary layers outward mirrored the cycles of waiting and moving that had defined production. The practical frictions were accepted as natural extensions of the challenges already faced. The public perception of smooth emergence contrasted with the interior understanding of fragile persistence, but both were real in their own way. And the calm acknowledgement that outcomes would take time gave the team the steadiness they needed to endure this stage, as they had endured the others. The film's journey outward was not spectacular, but it was steady. Each layer carried it further from the intimacy of creation and closer to the uncertainty of public life. Each friction tested patience, but did not break resolve. Each difference between perception and understanding reminded the team of the unseen labor behind what audiences took for granted. And through it all, there was the quiet recognition that the process itself mattered as much as the outcomes yet to come. The Basketball Diaries moved outward into the world layer by layer, step by step, carried not by sudden leaps but by persistence, patience, and the steady will of those who believed that its raw honesty deserved to be seen. The Basketball Diaries was never the kind of film that carried with it a chorus of public promises, shouted before the work was even finished. Its nature was too fragile, its subject too raw, for such bold declarations. The commitments that surrounded it were quieter, made more of trust and patience than spectacle. Everyone involved seemed to understand that this was not a project that could guarantee broad comfort or easy returns. What it could guarantee was honesty. That honesty drew certain kinds of commitment. People who wanted to see truth put on screen, who believed in the power of showing youth undone, not as cautionary tale dressed in gloss, but as lived collapse. These commitments felt sensible because they matched the shape of the film. They were steady, not extravagant, designed to support the story's weight without expecting it to become something it was not. For those who stepped into this circle, the expectation was never that the film would create sudden windfalls or dramatic headlines. The hope was that it would matter, that it would endure, that it would make a mark on those who saw it. In that sense, the promise of sharing if things went well was framed less in terms of financial division and more in terms of recognition. If the film resonated, then the people who carried it could share in the pride of knowing their risk had not been wasted. The actors who gave themselves over to the intensity of its scenes, the crew who carried the burden of turning raw spaces into cinematic truth, the producers who had steadied the project through long uncertainty, all of them knew that their reward, if it came, would be measured partly in recognition, partly in the knowledge that they had carried something difficult into being. Settlements and statements always come later than headlines, and this film was no exception. Public chatter after release often seemed to treat the film's presence as immediate and complete, as though the act of showing it to audiences was the same as resolving everything that surrounded it. But for those inside, the headlines were only one layer. Beneath them, the process of finalizing commitments, of distributing shares, of balancing promises took much longer. This delay was lived as a kind of extended echo of the film's making. Just as production had taught them to endure waiting between takes, between days, between uncertain stages of progress, so too did this phase require patience. The news of the film's release was quick, the settling of its path was slow. Waiting became a cultural rhythm, not just of this film but of filmmaking in general, and those who had carried the Basketball Diaries understood it in their bones. They had waited for initial support, waited through tight schedules, waited for chatter to build, waited for release, and now they waited again as the unseen structures of distribution and commitment worked themselves out. This rhythm was not comfortable, but it was familiar. People adapted to it, filling the spaces of waiting with other work, with reflection, with conversation. The pauses were endured with the same quiet patience that had marked so much of the film's journey. It was never about rushing to an endpoint, but about accepting that in film, the intervals of silence are as much a part of the process as the bursts of visible activity. For those who had given so much of themselves, the patience required in this final stretch was a test of endurance. Actors had already moved on to new roles, crew members to new projects, yet each carried a thread of attachment to this film, waiting for the final settling of what they had helped build. Their promises to each other lingered in quiet ways. Words exchanged on set about what it would mean if the film found its audience, small assurances that sacrifices made under heat and fatigue would one day feel worthwhile. Those promises could not be fulfilled immediately. They had to live through time, through the slow processes of allocation and acknowledgement. The difference between what audiences saw and what the participants lived was again sharp at this stage. To the public, the film existed as a finished object. It had been made, it had been seen, it had been reviewed. For those inside, it was still unfinished in another sense, because the commitments that surrounded it had not fully settled. They lived with the quiet awareness that outcomes arrive later, often long after public interest has moved on. That dissonance was part of the rhythm they had come to accept. The promises that surrounded this film were rarely loud or grandiose, but they were deeply felt. The director promised to carry the vision through within the limits given, to hold to honesty even when pressure might push toward softening. The actors promised to bear the weight of performances that demanded vulnerability, to show collapse without vanity. The crew promised to deliver professionalism under constraint, to make raw spaces cinematic even when resources were thin. The producers promised to shepherd the work patiently, to steady it through delays and uncertainty. None of these promises were written into public declarations, but all of them were lived daily. When things went well, when an audience member spoke with admiration, when a critic acknowledged the intensity, when the film lingered in conversation, the sharing was immediate, even if informal. People who had once sweated together in cramped locations shared glances, messages, and pride. Their promises to each other were fulfilled in those moments, not through official settlements, but through recognition that the work had mattered. Later, when the slower processes of allocation eventually caught up, the sharing became more tangible, but by then the deeper reward had already been felt. The patience required in these stretches could not be rushed. The participants learned to accept the delay as part of the cycle, the way seasons follow one another without being forced. Just as the film had captured the slow unraveling of a life over time, so too did the commitments surrounding it unravel slowly toward their resolution. The alignment between story and process was striking. Both required endurance, both carried discomfort, both eventually reached clarity only after long uncertainty. The cultural rhythm of film projects teaches those involved that patience is as vital as ambition. The Basketball Diaries reinforced this truth. From the earliest fragile support through production, release, distribution, and final settlements, every stage carried pauses where little seemed to move. Each pause tested resolve, and each taught the participants to trust in the slow unfolding of outcomes. That trust became part of the film's identity, a steady undercurrent beneath its rawness. Looking back, what mattered most in this stage was not the eventual totals or official statements, but the way people lived through the waiting. They remembered the promises made in sweat and exhaustion on set, they recognized each other in the moments of pride when audiences responded, and they endured the long silences with quiet patience. These experiences bound them together more strongly than any formal arrangement. They shared not just in outcomes, but in the rhythm of the journey itself, the Basketball Diaries stands as a record of these lived commitments. Its path was surrounded by promises kept quietly, fulfilled slowly, acknowledged with patience. Its participants carried expectations shaped not by spectacle, but by honesty. Settlements arrived later than headlines, as they always do, but the team had learned long before to accept that rhythm. Waiting became their companion, patience their discipline, endurance their achievement. The film's final form on screen captures collapse and resilience, but its life beyond the screen also carried those same qualities. It collapsed under pressure and rose through patience. It demanded honesty and rewarded endurance. It was made, carried, and released by people who understood that film is as much about the spaces between as it is about the moments of visibility. The Basketball Diaries carried its outcome not as a sudden verdict, but as a gradual picture that revealed itself through time, a picture that felt plain and inevitable to those who had lived inside it from the very beginning.